One fact that I believe is overlooked is the fact that morality presupposes a larger metaphysical and anthropological context, that is, a specific view on the nature of reality more generally, and a specific view on the nature of the human person. Our view on morality is shaped by these two things more than anything else. That is why, if you want a well thought out, clearly defined morality, you need, as a necessary prerequisite, a clearly defined, well thought out view on metaphysics and anthropology. That is something I hope to emphasize on this channel. The study of the most fundamental questions concerning ethics is called Metaethics, and metaphysics and anthropology play a big role in metaethics. Whenever you see large-scale shifts in what a society believes, very often that either leads to or results from a major metaethical shift. Many Christians, and people of a more conservative or traditional persuasion more generally, are usually not big fans of the recent metaethical shifts that have defined the past few decades, and, well, why would they? The problem is, who are they to turn to? Instead of turning to the pillars of the classical and Christian worldview, they tend to turn to the talking heads of the conservative movement who promote a generic, run-of-the-mill conservatism. And while I would say what a lot of these people say is true, they also say a lot of stuff that I, as a Catholic and a Christian, would find problematic when you really begin to understand the nitty-gritties of the Christian worldview. One example would be Dennis Prager. Prager is a conservative talk show host who runs a YouTube channel titled PragerU. He is currently one of the major names of popular contemporary conservatism, particularly in its more online varieties. Back in 2014, he published a video titled, "Are People Born Good?" Let's take a deep dive into this video and analyze it from a Christian perspective. Now, as a side note, before we go any further, I think I should point out the fact that Dennis Prager was raised as an Orthodox Jew. He came from an Orthodox Jewish family, and that was the tradition that he was sort of molded in. In adulthood, he left the Orthodox Jewish movement, but still religiously identifies as a Jew, which can be seen in the fact that, as an adult, he maintains many of the traditional beliefs of Judaism and continues to take part in some of the liturgical and devotional practices of Judaism. As a result, as a man who isn't Catholic, I don't expect him to adhere to or even have any understanding of the traditional anthropology of Christianity. Not because he's not a smart man who couldn't understand it, but because that's not the faith tradition or ideological school of thought that he came from. He's therefore not a heretic, in the strict canonical sense. The canonical definition of a heretic is a member of the church who, at some point after being initiated into the church through baptism, either rejected church teaching or accepted a faulty interpretation of church teaching. That doesn't mean, though, that his opinions aren't objectively right or wrong. His views may, to various degrees, either align or not align with the teachings of sacred scripture, sacred tradition, and the magisterium of the church, which is essentially the standard that we as Christians use to judge truth from falsehood. Thus, it is important to analyze or engage the views of non-Catholics and non-Christians. So without further ado, let's get into it.
There are two important, indeed fundamental questions you have to answer in life. The first is there a God, specifically a moral and judging creator? The second is, are people basically good?
I would agree with this claim. Anthropology, metaphysics, and spirituality/religion are the three most influential factors in determining our moral code.
Your answer to the second question will shape just about all of your moral, social, and political views even more than whether you believe in God?
That's debatable. I mean, whether or not you believe in God is extremely important in determining whether or not you believe in objective morality, or if you do believe in objective morality, how you would justify the existence of such an objective moral code. That's why religious people and atheists often either A, come to radically different moral conclusions, or B, have radically different reasons for coming to the same or similar conclusions. Sometimes, though, theists and atheists do come to the same or similar conclusions, and even for similar reasons. But again, when you step back and really start asking them the broadest possible meta-ethical questions, why do I believe what I believe? On what am I basing my ethical claims? What it is that ultimately lays the basis for your ethical beliefs will be something completely different. But what is it that is the linchpin of your entire ethical worldview? What is its ultimate foundations? Is it anthropology? Or is it metaphysics and religion? I would say that metaphysics and religion is more fundamental in determining your ethical worldview than anthropology. Not that anthropology isn't one of the foundational features, not that it isn't important, but I would say that it isn't more fundamental than religion or metaphysics.
That's why a believer and an atheist who have the same views about human nature almost always have the same social and political views.
I would agree, but to a limited extent. Anthropology is one of the things that lays the basis for morality, and morality is one of the things that lays the basis for your view on politics and the law. So people with the same or similar anthropology will, as a result, in the long term, have the same or similar views on politics. The problem is, Prager is a Jew, living in a country that traditionally was majority Christian, and whose culture was highly influenced by Christianity. Prager's entire worldview is shaped by the American cultural, social, ideological, and political landscape, where most of the people who don't share his religious beliefs come from one of the next closest religions, and therefore there's by definition going to be a lot of overlap. I therefore fear that Prager may just be assuming that it's possible for people with different religious views to have the same or similar anthropology, because his anthropology as a Jew is already kind of similar to the anthropology of most Christians. Now, it is true that, from a Catholic perspective, there are some truths which can be known by all people through the use of reason, and other truths which can only be known through divine revelation. Therefore, there are certain anthropological truths which all people can agree on, but we shouldn't act as if anthropology can be completely divorced from spirituality or metaphysics, or that there aren't some anthropological truths which can only be known through divine revelation. And he doesn't explicitly say that. He doesn't explicitly say that anthropology can be divorced from spirituality or metaphysics, but he says certain things that could lead people to those conclusions. And this can be seen in the fact that while some atheists have an anthropology very similar to that of Christians, the vast majority of atheists have an anthropology that is radically different from that of Jews and Christians, at least in some respects. I mean, think about it. In spite of their many similarities, there still are differences between Jews and Christians in terms of their broader ideology, and therefore, there end up being differences between Jewish anthropology and Christian anthropology. But again, if Judaism and Christianity can be so closely related and yet still have clearly distinct and differing anthropologies, how much bigger do you think the difference is between a Christian or a Jew on the one hand and an atheist on the other hand? But now let's get into the heart of what Prager is saying.
Let me give you some examples. You've probably heard the phrase, poverty causes crime. If you believe that people are basically good, you are likely to believe that poverty or bigotry or some other outside force causes people to commit violent crime. That's the only way you can make sense of the fact that some people commit crimes despite their basically good nature. Something drove them to it. But if you don't believe people are basically good, you're far more likely to blame the criminals themselves, not outside forces, for their actions. One more example. In a society where it is believed that people are basically good, parents and society don't devote great efforts toward making good people. After all, if we're born good, why do you have to teach goodness? On the other hand, those who don't believe we are born all that good understand that parents and society have to undertake major efforts to make children into good adults. Okay then, are people basically good? As I will show, given humanity's history, the answer should be obvious. Of course, human nature isn't basically good.
The problem, I think, is what does Prager mean when he says inherently good? And what is the larger methodology that he uses to demonstrate this point? There are a few different ways in which we could go about making certain conclusions about the nature of a thing, and the method that Mr. Prager uses, I believe, is one that most Catholics and Christians should take serious issue with.
Now, this doesn't mean that people are basically bad. We are born with real potential to do good, but we are not basically good.
The thing is, what does Prager mean by basically good? It appears as if Prager is saying that we are born neither virtuous nor vicious, neither habitually good nor habitually evil. We have the capacity, even the desire to do good, but being good, holy, virtuous, is not the default position. It is for this reason that humans have to be formed into good people. But this is where I would disagree with Prager. According to Catholic metaphysics, goodness can be defined as something identifiable either with existence as such or with anything that perfects our existence. Existence is seen by many people in the Catholic tradition, like St. Thomas Aquinas, as being the quote-unquote first good, because it is that which lays the basis for all other goods, and all other goods outside of existence perfect or actualize our existence. And this leads to a very specific view on the nature of evil. Evil is seen in traditional Catholic theology and philosophy as the absence or corruption of some due good. That is, when some good that should be there is either absent or corrupted, then a thing is evil. Every being that exists, insofar as it exists, is inherently good, and this applies even to humans. Yet how do humans, if we are inherently good, have such a proclivity towards evil? It is because since God created human nature is inherently good. Yet human nature, as created by God, was corrupted by the effects of the fall, and this is the notion of original sin. Now don't forget, original sin is not the notion that the descendants of Adam and Eve are responsible for the sin of Adam and Eve. Rather, original sin refers to the condition of human nature more generally. The sin of Adam and Eve had a certain effect on human nature as such, namely it corrupted it. Human nature, as passed on from Adam and Eve to their descendants, was not human nature in its pure, uncorrupted form, the form that it was created in by God, but rather what Adam and Eve passed on to their descendants was human nature corrupted and deprived of the effects of God's grace. Insofar as humans exist, and have the faculties necessary to obtain certain perfections, they are inherently good. A good thing can be corrupted or do bad things without ceasing to be inherently good. Considering the definition of goodness that we just put forward, a thing couldn't completely lack goodness without completely ceasing to exist. Think about it. Existence as such is inherently good, and every quality or perfection that we predicate onto a thing perfects that thing's being. Therefore, goodness is connected with the thing coming into existence or growing closer to the standard of how a thing is or should be. If we were to take away every good from a thing, it would cease to exist, because there would be nothing left of that thing. Thus, there is no such thing as a being, by definition, being neutral. This is the Catholic perspective. Now, I know that Mr. Prager, being Jewish, doesn't necessarily share the set of presuppositions that Catholics do. But you can see here that there's a difference in metaphysics that leads to a difference in anthropology, which then leads to a difference in metaethics. Thus, I would say, firstly, never underestimate the importance of these foundational questions. But secondly, I would say that we as Catholics, knowing the difference between Prager's thought and traditional Catholic doctrine, should find Prager's view to be problematic. And this is true, especially in terms of the methodology that produces his thought. Now, I'm not entirely sure how he arrived at the conclusions that he did, and in the off chance that either he or one of his ideological supporters sees this video, feel free to correct me, but it appears as if Prager is beginning by looking at human actions and then attempting to reverse engineer a larger, overarching vision of human nature from that. He begins with an analysis of human actions and then attempts to abstract from that some understanding of human nature more generally. And he actually seems to imply that based on certain comments he put forward later on in the video. He says that over the course of human history, we've done such evil that, as a result, we can conclude that humans, while maybe not inherently evil, are not inherently good. And this is a method that I would find problematic. Humans do a lot of different, even contradictory things. If your starting point is the messy and convoluted world of human behavior, you will end up with a messy and convoluted view of human nature. How do you contextualize human behavior unless you have some already existent standard of how humans are or should be? It therefore seems like a better method to determine the nature of the human person as such, as a beginning point, and then trying to analyze human actions in light of that. Actions are produced by beings who have an essence, and our essence, in turn, determines the parameters, or it delineates the general structure of our existence, thereby determining how a thing is or how a thing should be. And thus, every action that we do is either in line with or a deviation from human nature. So I would say, borrowing from Aristotle, borrowing from the entire Catholic tradition, that good actions, virtuous actions, holy actions, rational actions are in line with human nature, and that evil actions represent a deviation from the way things should be, or a corruption of human nature. Having a clearly defined view on human nature as your starting point allows you to make sense of human actions, and when this is not the case, we say a lot of nonsense, like this particular piece of nonsense, which is the most famous part of his video.
Take babies. Babies are lovable and innocent, but they're not good. They're entirely self-centered, as they have to be in order to survive. I want mommy, I want milk, I want to be held, I want to be comforted, and if you do not do all these things immediately, I will ruin your life. That's not goodness. That's narcissism. We are born narcissists, preoccupied with number one, ourselves. And if you've ever worked with kids, you know how cruel, how bullying they can be. And don't parents have to tell their child tens of thousands of times, say thank you? Now, why is that? If we're naturally good, wouldn't feeling and expressing gratitude come naturally?
Are babies narcissists, though? I mean, narcissism is a psychological disorder. According to the DSM, narcissistic personality disorder is defined by patterns of behavior rooted in, quote, grandiosity, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy, unquote. Narcissists believe that they are superior to others, are unique, are special, or are gifted, even if they're not, or even if they have no reason to believe they are, and thus expect others to recognize this. Narcissists tend to overstate their own perfections, and thus will often take part in forms of social withdrawal or alienation if their flaws are exposed. Because narcissists tend to be self-centered, they also tend to lack empathy, be exploitative, and tend to be very shallow. People with narcissistic personality disorder tend to assume that everyone at all times is concerned with their personal needs and will often express their needs to others at great length and in deep detail, even going on to speak of their wants and needs at inappropriate times or for inappropriate lengths. Yet, at the same time, they will show a sense of disinterest or even emotional coldness at the needs of others, even family members and close friends, and may even begin to feel impatient or irritated with others when other people spend any length of time talking about their own wants and needs. Narcissistic personality disorder often accompanies other similar psychological disorders, such as histrionic personality disorder, a psychological disorder in which an individual feels uncomfortable or unappreciated when they are not the center of attention. Narcissists will often believe that they have attained or can attain or are committed to attaining perfection, while others are not as devoted to the attainment of perfection and possibly may even lack the ability to do so. They will also often lack generosity while doing everything they can to indulge themselves. Narcissism is a psychological disorder caused by a variety of different factors, including, but not limited to, being rejected or neglected as a child, parents who either are overly critical of the child or give the child excessive praise, certain genetic predispositions or neurobiological states, or having a fragile ego as a child. Now, are babies narcissists? Well, think about it this way. In the early stages of fetal development, the baby didn't have a brain, or only had a partially developed brain. The baby was therefore not conscious, or was only partially conscious. And even in the later parts of its development, it was still in a sleep-like state. It never had to do anything to gain warmth, protection, or nourishment. Then, the muscles in the mother's womb begin to contract, and the baby is expelled from the mother's womb, thereby abruptly awakening it from its sleep-like state. It no longer receives nourishment directly from the mother whenever the mother eats. It is now entirely on its own, physically speaking, and it has all these physical needs, but lacks the physical or cognitive ability to fulfill these needs on its own, and it even lacks the physical or cognitive capacity to communicate its wants and needs to others. Are babies self-centered? In a sense, yes. Are they that way as a result of a psychological disorder or as a result of vice? No. And even when children tend to be ungrateful, self-centered, or rude, that is more the result of them not knowing any better or of immaturity, not, again, because of a psychological disorder. A psychological disorder that very often has deep-seated developmental and/or biological foundations. And another thing to consider is the fact that some studies have shown that narcissistic personality disorder has a prevalence of about 1 to 15% of the total US population. Some surveys have showed that specific community samples have produced rates of 0.5% to 5%. So in some instances, anywhere from less than 1% to less than 10% of a community may have narcissistic personality disorder. But according to Dennis Prager, most babies and most children are narcissists. Now again, I know he was probably using the term narcissist colloquially, but you need to be careful in your language, and you need to be precise in your language, because most children and babies are going to act in a way that most people would say is narcissistic, but they grow out of it, because they're not actually narcissists. You know that someone is a narcissist, or that they are at risk of developing narcissism, if they never really grow out of that self-centered, ungrateful, or rude state, or when they never learn why such behaviors are wrong. And again, even people who accept or agree with Mr. Prager's general view should also nuance their view, because there is scientific evidence that shows that even young children and babies have the capacity for empathy and some sense of fairness. Researchers have found that humans are neurologically hardwired for these exact moral sentiments. Children as young as 10 months have been demonstrated to show distress or sadness in response to others who also show signs of pain or distress, as well as expressing a desire to help them. In an article published by the National Center for Biotechnology Information, which is associated for the National Institute of Health, it quotes from an older study that suggests that these reactions may not fall into the strict psychological definition of empathy, since empathy is a response specifically to the pain of others, whereas babies show some of the signs of empathy before they are neurologically capable of distinguishing between self and others. And again, people, when they're first born, lack the capacity to differentiate between themselves and others. Nonetheless, these empathy-like behaviors only increase as the child develops the capacity to distinguish between self and others. Paul Bloom, in his work Just Babies: The Origins of Good and Evil, notes how, in one experiment, psychologists would make their labs look like homes, but allow it to become very messy. As they were cleaning it, they would bring in a group of children between 1.5 years and 3 years of age, and the majority of these babies attempted to help the adults in cleaning. Psychologists know that children have empathetic tendencies, but the motivation remains less clear. What we do know is that much later, but still relatively early on in their development, some studies suggest as early as between 3 and 4 years of age, children begin to think about the consequences of their actions and which ones are best for the person they are helping. Bloom also notes similar studies concerning fairness. Psychologists told a group of children between the ages of 6 and 8 a story of 2 people who did equal amounts of work, and they were rewarded with a particular item. There were 3 of the item given as a reward. Because the 2 people in the story did equal amounts of work, each one was given 1 of the item, but there was still 1 left over. When the children were asked whether or not they should give the item to one of the other people or throw it away, almost all of the children said that you should throw it away. A similar study was done on a group of children, some as young as 10 months old, others 16 months old. The children were shown a puppet show in which there were 4 characters. 2 of them would take turns giving a series of colored discs to the other. One character would give an even amount of colored discs to all the recipients, whereas the second one would give all to one character and none to the others. When asked which one they preferred, the 10-month-olds chose randomly, whereas the 16-month-olds almost always chose the one who divided up the discs evenly. This suggests that as early as 16 months of age, children know the difference between fair and unfair distribution, and seem to believe that it is wrong to give certain goods to someone arbitrarily, or to withhold some good from someone arbitrarily, as well as understanding that equal amounts of work entitle you to equal benefits. So we know that young children, to some extent, are capable of empathy and have some basic concept of fairness, a central element of justice. And again, I don't want to read more into the studies than what's actually there, but I would say that this would seem to imply the Catholic view that humans are inherently good, but that human nature is eventually corrupted. Again, it seems to me as if Prager is using the term narcissist colloquially. But the thing is, being inherently good doesn't mean that that goodness can't be corrupted. Being inherently good doesn't mean that there's no room to grow as individuals. Had Adam and Eve never fallen into sin, would there be any need for further growth in holiness and virtue? That's a legit question. But you see how, for Prager, if there is room to grow as a person, then that means you aren't actually inherently good, something which Catholic metaethics and metaphysics would firmly reject.